I wanted to do a quick video about question stems and some thoughts on how they might be useful to both educators and to learners. And what prompted this thought on my part was the addition of a new question stem capability to another kind of technology tool that I write about and demo sometimes, and it's an online service called Insert Learning. And what this tool allows educators and students to do is to add elements on top of existing web content. That's what I mean by layering. They're putting highlighting and notes and questions, in this case, on top of existing web content as a way to help others learn and to help themselves learn, depending upon if you're looking at this resource as an educator or as a student. Now, this is the perspective the teacher has, and I do have other videos about Insert Learning, and I'll reference that in the page where I post this video. And what you see along the very left-hand column here are the various tools for adding notes, adding questions, adding discussion prompts, etc. And I'll quickly show you how the question works. So if I select the question tool and I select a location, this opportunity to generate a question appears below. Now I can just write a question. I can write an open-ended question. I can write a multiple choice question. There's lots that can be done with this particular tool that I'm not going to get into. But what I did want to demonstrate or show is this question stem option. So you can see here, click here to select a stem. So if I reveal the options, you'll see that the developers have made some suggestion question stems. And their focus is on the kinds of questions that can apply, they argue, to basically any kind of text information. So it's kind of independent of the focus and the purpose of the text. And so as a learner, as a reader perhaps, exposure to these different kinds of questions can lead you to process that text more effectively. I understand why they do that, right? Because I think there are better kinds of question stems, both for guiding students and that students can perhaps use to guide themselves, but these other kinds of question stems, which I will mention or explain maybe in a minute, are more dependent upon the purpose for reading, the kind of material, etc. And not knowing how this tool will be applied, the developers, obviously couldn't recommend a certain kind of question. So I would recommend that if what I am explaining here is of interest, that educators just get into some kind of search engine on in a browser and Google or search or whatever you want to think of it as for question stems. And here's just an example of what you might find. So this is a link. I'll add a couple links to, again, the page in which this video appears that will show you different kinds of stems. So here the stems are more relevant to different purposes and different kinds of material. but you can see what they are. That they don't actually write the question for you. They kind of provide questions suited to accomplishing different things. And this group of questions was proposed by someone saying, well, here are different ways to try to get students to think critically. So if you're trying to work on critical thinking skills and you want students to apply them to particular content, you can, yourself read part of the content and then at different locations or overall kind of fill in the details to turn these stems into content-specific questions. So that, I think, is a better approach, and that's the way I try to get people to think about question stems. So a couple of points. Why question stems? Why searching out lists such as this would be helpful? Well, first of all, what I think it does for educators is to diversify the kinds of questions that they assign. So I tend to think of questions as a way to influence the thinking or reasoning or whatever you would like to describe it, of the cognitive activity of the learner. And so it's to get the learner to, in response to the question, engage in a certain kind of cognitive activity that they may or may not have engaged in on their own. And I think a limitation we all can get into is to rely on a certain kind of question that we prefer to ask. Looking at lists like this, maybe looking at them as you are preparing instructional content, you start to see different possibilities and to use them. I'm also a big fan, and I think those people who study behavior can use question stems in a different way, and that basically is to provide them to students so that students asking each other questions, or students maybe even writing questions for themselves, begin to understand the kinds of understanding perhaps that can be expected of them. And the questions, when they try to use a certain kind of question relevant to specific assigned material, can give them insights into maybe how they should think about that material. So explore, look up online, find some lists of question stems, and then try them out. Try to diversify the kinds of questions you ask, and consider what the questions maybe are encouraging in the learner. How do they get learners to think? That's the point, getting learners to think.